Let me begin by thanking Dr. Mickelson and the staff at OBI for inviting me here this evening, as well as the rest of us, to provide an opportunity for us to chat a little bit about our research. As indicated by the slide, my name is J.B. Orange. As pointed out, I'm a researcher at the University of Western Ontario, or Western University. I'm a speech-language pathologist by training, and my segment this evening should, I hope, enlighten you about issues related to communication and language in individuals who have dementia other than Alzheimer's disease. So as Dr. Finger pointed out, dementia, a syndrome, a collection of multiple diseases, including the frontotemporal lobe components to them and Alzheimer's disease, is well described in the literature relative to the progressive degeneration in a variety of mental faculties and skill sets, and that we can operationalize those or measure those performances and cognitive skills, but also in areas that I think have personal relevance for many of you here this evening, and that includes the number D up there in red, at least on my screen here, and that is language and communication are impaired in individuals with dementia using the criteria from the National Institute of Aging as well as the Alzheimer's Association in the United States. So the top one, it really refers to memory or learning components, and the second is executive function, judgment, reasoning, and insightfulness, which we often see impaired in individuals with frontotemporal dementia. The other two, the visual spatial abilities, foreground from background, are often seen in individuals with other types of non-Alzheimer's dementia, and then the last one is changes in personality, comportment, and behavior. And in order for someone to have dementia, they have to have two of these five, according to these older research criteria. But I can say to you that the D, the one in red, is almost always impaired in individuals in the early onset of dementia, regardless of whether it's Alzheimer's disease or others. That is, language and communication problems are among the hallmark features of the impairments in dementia, and particularly those with certain types of frontotemporal dementia. Now, more recently, the American Psychiatric Association produced its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5 in 2013 that decided to change the term dementia to minor or major neurocognitive disorders. It's still dementia. But what they did was they operationalized a couple of extra additional criteria, and one in particular that has relevance for this evening's discussion is this notion of social cognition that Dr. Finger talked about. But I want to highlight the fact that language remains a core feature, hallmark feature of dementia. And so for many of us who are researchers or clinicians or family caregivers or professional caregivers, it's this deterioration in the language skills and the communication skills that create a great deal of challenge for us in the care. So I'm going to try and address those issues for you tonight in some of the research that we've been doing in individuals with dementias other than Alzheimer's disease. So language and communication in dementia, as I pointed out, is emerging very early in the course of the disease, and it varies by the clinical stage of the disease, and it is the utmost concern to care providers. And there's a broad range of skills across each of these early or mild, middle or moderate, or late or severe stages of the disease, but nonetheless we can try and at least compartmentalize as best we can these language challenges that go across each of the clinical stages. And this particular graph from a study we did some time ago illustrates the overlapping performance by individuals with early stage Alzheimer's disease, middle stage Alzheimer's disease, and late stage Alzheimer's disease, and how they differ from those with controls. And this pattern, where we have a distinction between the early clinical stage of dementia and the late clinical stage, is distinct and non-overlapping, is well replicated across those even beyond Alzheimer's disease, and how they differ quite substantially from the controls is also well known. And so we can begin to try and monitor the progression of dementia, not only by clinical components but also issues related to language performance as well. So in Canada, approximately 50% of the hundreds of thousands of individuals with dementia are cared for in the home by family caregivers. The family caregivers act really as the primary contact for their relatives within the home, and the caregiving experience creates a great deal of stress and burden, more so than caregivers who are looking after others with other types of diseases. And unfortunately, family caregivers of individuals with dementia suffer all sorts of levels of burden and stress. This particular model, developed by a colleague of mine here now at Western, Marie Savundanayagam, identifies the relationships between communication problems and problem behaviors, sometimes referred to as responsive behaviors or challenging behaviors. And in Marie's model, Marie and colleagues, Mary Lou Hummert and Rhonda Montgomery, they identify these associations, not causative, they're just linked with one another, in that people who have these problem behaviors, which we often see in individuals with frontotemporal lobe dementia, create challenges and burdens for family caregivers. Different types of burden, whether it's a demand burden, a stress burden, objective burden, that is psychological, physiological, and emotional types of burden. And so, as a researcher in the language science area, I'm keen on trying to establish what of these problem behaviors are linked with communication problems, that is, difficulty getting the words out, being able to understand what people say to you in writing. And so this particular model links these communication difficulties with problem behaviors that caregivers find rather burdensome across a number of dimensions. And so we try and target interventions that might otherwise help reduce these problem behaviors. Again, very obvious in individuals with frontal lobe dementia. So spouses have noted in a variety of studies the strain and stress and difficulties they have in interacting with their family members. Spouses talk about not being able to confide in their relative, not being understood by their relative, can't have conversations, and as a result, their relative, who has the dementia, gets very angry, and they have these difficult, challenging behaviors. Other spouses, like a family member, a couple that I interviewed many, many years ago here in London, talked about the mourning that they go through, the difficulties in the breakdown in their relationship, marital relationship, friendly relationship. And this particular excerpt comes from a couple who, the husband was in the early stage of dementia. And so people are quite in tune with the challenges in maintaining that relationship and that connection with one another. It's not only spouses, but also children whose parents suffer from dementia. These are excerpts from a couple of studies from Karen Parsons at MUN University, Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, in which a son says that it's better off that his father is dead because they can't have that same sort of relationship, which is terrible. Even speech-language pathologists who are meant to be trained in communicating effectively can have spouses who unfortunately get dementia, and even for those of us who are trained in the area of speech and language, can find the meandering conversations quite problematic. And so this is not an easy task to maintain a relationship through language and through communication. This particular excerpt from Richard Taylor back in 2007 speaks to the perspective of someone who has, in this particular case, Alzheimer's disease, but I thought it rather poignant to highlight that what he's writing about, and I've shown in this excerpt, is that we sometimes hound our friends or relatives with lots of questions. And oftentimes, we take control and we express a lot. And oftentimes, we just need to be an active listener. And I'm going to go through some strategies tonight that might mitigate your propensity to try and talk too much that creates real challenges, and oftentimes we need to be an active listener and to ensure that our friend and or relative is being heard, even though sometimes it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or we have to work extra hard to try and piece together the topics or the themes of what they're talking about. As Dr. Fingers pointed out, there are multiple variants to frontotemporal lobe dementia, and the ones in particular that I've been studying with Dr. Finger and Dr. Strong, among others, and Dr. Curtis includes those in the primary progressive aphasia category that include those with non-fluent agrammatic as well as semantic dementia and logopenic. These are individuals who will present very early on, very specifically with language problems, and very few, if any, but subtle changes in cognition. And it's the deterioration in being able to read, being unable to call up the words, being unable to understand what people say to you that creates a great deal of challenges for them. And so I'm going to talk to you a little about some of the studies we've done with people with PPA, or primary progressive aphasia, and specifically the progressive non-fluent form of it as well. These particular subtypes of the FTD, and this is the lateral view of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, it's temporal down here, and this is the occipital in the back. And each one of these three subtypes of the PPA happen in different regions of the brain, and as a result, they manifest very differently in terms of their language. And these particular subgroup, the PPA, it's language that really is the most early on marker. So for example, in this particular group, the semantic dementia, these individuals actually lose their mental dictionary. Items within their dictionary are lost. Little electron gremlins are deleting items from the mental dictionary, versus those who might have, for example, this non-fluent agrammatic. They tend to have problems with grammar or syntax, the things we learned about in elementary school about the order of words, although they all have word-finding difficulties. This group of people have this mental dictionary better intact, and we just need to help provide the ramp to help them retrieve the words. Unfortunately for individuals with semantic dementia, once they get into that mental dictionary, oftentimes, unfortunately, like Swiss cheese, those memories of and stored words are gone. So this is a chart that illustrates data from a study that one of my master's students did a couple of years ago in concert with work with Dr. Strong on individuals with ALS. For the longest time, people didn't think that individuals with ALS had any form of cognitive impairment and dementia, and it was really in my early time here at Western and linking up with the late Dr. Andy Leeper and Dr. Strong that we began to examine the language and motor and cognitive performances of individuals with ALS, and unfortunately individuals with ALS do end up with dementia, and many of them end up with cognitive impairment. Some of them, smaller group, ends up with the frontal lobe dementia. But I was interested in the language components of these individuals because actually it emanated from the early case in the late 80s and early 90s. Some of you may remember Sue Rodriguez out in British Columbia, who was considering assisted dying with physicians, and the question was, well, she has, of course, the competence to do that. And then the question was, well, does she really? We always thought that maybe those who had ALS didn't have cognitive impairment, but we showed that, and many others in multiple labs internationally. But what we were able to find out is that individuals with ALS also, besides just being a difficulty in movements of our body, also had difficulties with language, that is, calling up the words. And this particular graph illustrates that on this side, with a very large, wide bar graphs here, and the narrow ones for the control subjects over here, we found that over time, individuals with ALS have greater difficulty calling up words. It was this anomia, or lack of finding the words, that helped distinguish individuals with ALS versus those who are controls. And in particular, we knew that there was a subgroup of those in ALS who had real distinct language difficulties. And in particular, when we made some comparisons along a subgroup of nouns, that is, people trying to remember words that were in the living category, that is, tell me the names of as many sea creatures as you can, or breeds of dogs, or names of birds, versus those in a non-living category. Tell me in 1 minute the number of words that are tools, musical instruments. We found that the distinction between those with ALS and those with controls were substantial. That is, they had a higher performance here in the controls, much lower in the ALS group, and as a matter of fact, we saw that even within the ALS group, the subgroup showed significantly more errors in living versus non-living categories. You say, well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, we know that from the literature in Alzheimer's disease, that individuals with Alzheimer's disease tend to have early problems with difficulties with living items, and they tend to be stored towards the backside of the left hemisphere, versus the non-living categories. Again, musical instruments, household items, tools, they tend to be stored towards the front part of the left hemisphere. So we're beginning to see then that the pathology in ALS, whereas we thought it was just really in the peripheral nervous system, is really affecting some of these language performances in those areas of the brain that might be overlapping with some other disease states. And so from a language perspective, we found that rather intriguing. So one other study that another student of mine in the lab conducted was on the perceptions that these family caregivers, whose relatives unfortunately have been diagnosed with frontotemporal lobe dementia, experienced as a result of the relative having this difficulty. And So Nancy Galvin from the Windsor area undertook her master's degree and examined these types of difficulties in language that are often seen in individuals with FTD. And what she found was from an occurrence of what we call pragmatic difficulties. That is, how you use your language in social context, which in some ways mirrors this new concept of social cognition, how you would actually say things appropriately to someone you don't know or at a job interview. And so Nancy's study illustrated that when these family members, the majority of whom were spouses, although there were some children in it, reported that their relatives with FTD had great deal of difficulty participating in conversations, initiating conversations, ending conversations, even switching from one topic of conversation to another, and that they had a great deal of difficulty expressing emotions, which is in alignment with Dr. Finger's research, which she also found from the perceptions of the family caregivers that their relatives, while it was a lower proportion of them, still had difficulties understanding figurative language, like metaphors and similes, in idiomatic forms of language, and that they often had difficulties taking turn. They were interrupting one another. That is, they weren't monitoring the conversations very well. The family caregivers also reported generically that their relatives have difficulties understanding and reading, and like many individuals with dementia, had difficulty with vocabulary. That is, they had anomia. They would be using words that were unrelated to one another, fork for boy, not words that were related, like girl for boy or salt for pepper. These were a little further from the target zone. These individuals family members identified that the most frequently occurring difficulties were that their relatives didn't let them know they didn't understand. They couldn't stay on the topic of conversation. They're shifting from one conversation to the next, and they really weren't correcting themselves. And that left family members out in the cold about, so where are we about having exchange of information and having a relationship? The most problematic difficulties that the family members perceived were related to the social appropriateness of it. And I get back to the Savundar-Nagam model. That is, these difficult or challenging behaviors, not just wandering, but saying things are inappropriate. Oh, grandma, your hair color's not doing that great for you. Step away from the smorgasbord, you're really putting on a little weight there. Those sorts of socially inappropriate that might be improper pragmatically, but also not having the vocabulary to stay on the same topic. And it was these difficulties, these inappropriate, socially inappropriate components that were the most obvious and most problematic, primarily for spouses, not so much for the non-spouses, the children or the nieces in the study, because presumably the spouses spend the majority of time with them, both personally and in social context as well. So what did the family members say works well? What are the strategies that they reported seem to work well with their relative who has FTD? Well, of course, part of it is I'm just going to ignore it. I'm just going to say that's just part of accepting it, and that, for a quarter of the group, that seemed to work well. The other groups said that redirecting their family members from the socially inappropriate comments or the socially inappropriate behaviors might otherwise be very helpful. And what we've found useful in other studies we've done, and those from our colleagues in the United States and the United Kingdom, is that you want to follow your relative's lead. Sometimes, as we listened to Richard Taylor's earlier comment, we need to be active listeners. And sometimes our relatives aren't going to make much sense, but we have to be prepared to follow that lead. And I'll show you some strategies in the next slides. But essentially, it was the adaptations that we need as family members that seemed to be appropriate to get to their world, to their level, their perceptions. What wasn't helpful, according to the family members, was getting upset and getting angry, and sometimes even ignoring that was not very helpful. And if we pointed out people's mistakes, we corrected them, that was not well received in terms of maintaining that relationship. So any sort of negative reaction that might align with some of the hormonal work that's being done by Dr. Finger and colleagues, we're seeing manifest in certain types of behaviors. So what would be useful strategies for us as clinician researchers to help our family members who deal with individuals who have a relative that doesn't have Alzheimer's disease? Well, I use the term back channeling here as part of the active listening. and I hope well, the lights are on, I can't see. I hope I have back channeling down here where people say, oh yeah, you know, the bobbing, the huh. Yeah, I don't get that from my students. They all fall asleep, they glassy look, and it didn't happen. But we need to, you know, maintain that contact. We also need to validate, because for some individuals with FTD, the larger group of those with FTD, they have a slightly different reality than we have. And oftentimes when we try to impose our own reality, as in the concept of reality orientation, that is met rather skeptically and leads to very bad outcomes. So we often have to make sure that we take their perspective, and if it doesn't make much sense, we can't necessarily argue the logic of that, because that's their reality and that's their sense. And as a result of having these memory difficulties and personality changes and the anomia, the word-finding difficulties, we might find our friends or relatives confabulating, making up things to try and fill in the gaps for the words that I don't know, or the memories that I've lost, or the inability for me to control my behaviors. And so we often then have to try and give them the words, because we're to be the ramp. We're not to be the tester. Let us, as the researchers and clinician scientists, test them, because they have the greatest deal of respect and relationship with you, so you don't need to test them, because forcing them to say something you already know is only going to make it worse. And I will show you a couple of examples and videos, if we have some time, about how that actually doesn't work. Finally, these last strategies, people might say, well, I have to lie. Well, part of it is not considering it as a lie, but it's bending the reality for yourself to get to their reality because of this made-up perspectives that they have. For some who have FTD, particularly in the Lewy body spectrum disorder, there may be hallucinations, visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, and we borrow from our colleagues in mental health that we acknowledge that our friend or relative sees those or hears those. We say to them, we don't hear it, we don't see it, but I know you see that, and I know it may be frightening for you, but we try and calm them relative to acknowledging those hallucinations. Work by my colleague Michelle Bourgeois at the University of Florida has developed a wonderful set of systems called the conversation memory notebooks, and these are electronic or hard copy form of photographs from people's years in their teens and 20s. They're developed in a way that there's one photograph on a page with uppercase and lowercase letters with a sad sentence written underneath it, a simple, active, declarative, not emotionally sad sentence, but one subject, one verb, and an object. And that sentence printed underneath or in electronic form acts as a wonderful distractor and taps into what is called episodic or time-based memory. And that can be very useful to try and minimize some of the agitation that we're seeing in individuals with frontotemporal lobe dementia. The final set of strategies that I have are related to the late Tom Kitwood's work coming out of England, and particularly as it applies to individuals with all forms of dementia, including frontotemporal lobe dementia. That is, we have to validate the feelings and experiences these individuals are having and to try and facilitate them in their world perceptions by helping provide some negotiation and collaboration for them, because they're having such great difficulty coming up with the words. Be the ramp. Provide the words. It doesn't accelerate the disorder, but it maintains that personal relationship so that they can be heard and you can be heard. Thanks.